All right. So the plan right now is it's seriously just reviewing what we did last time. So what I want to do is we talked about 3 different types of premise conclusion relationships. And these were like the parts that could go into complex arguments. And they had 3 different labels. Does anyone remember what they were? There were blank premises, and blank premises.
Serial, linked, and the other one I don't know how to pronounce
So
it.
serial and linked, those are correct. And the last one was convergent. And so convergent premises, well, does anyone want to describe any of them? What is a serial premise? What is a convergent premise? And what is a linked premise, or 2 linked premises? 2 serial premises and 2 convergent premises.
Linked premises are 2 statements that support a conclusion, but only do so together.
Exactly. That's a perfect definition. So yeah, it's a conclusion in which 2 premises working together, or it's an argument in which 2 premises working together form a conclusion. And our symbol for that is this. It's the linked arrow right here. Serial premises are what? Anyone want to take a stab?
They are reasons given in support of a more basic premise.
Yeah. So give me a second to make sure that I don't have okay, I'm muted. Good. Sorry, I just had to make sure chat bot was muted. Yeah. So what a serial premise is it's one premise supporting a second premise, which then supports the main conclusion. So that is this arrow to a premise to another premise, which leaves convergent. Convergent is one in which you have 2 entirely separate reasons for the same thing. And that's where you have these 2 disconnected arrows pointing towards your conclusion. So just to practice, where I said this is the linked premise arrow, this is the serial premise arrow, and this is the convergent premise arrow. So looking at that, we have a simple argument here. The Nets will be better than the Knicks this year. The Nets have more superstar players. The Nets have Durant, Harden, and Irving. So what of these 3 structures goes with this simple argument? Which of these, so first off, what's the relationship between 1, 2, and 3? Do we have a case in which it's a conclusion that has 2 independent reasons for it? Is it a case in which you have one premise supporting another premise that's supporting a conclusion? Or is it a case in which you have 2 premises that are working together to support a conclusion that neither of them by themselves support?
I would say personally, these look like serial, like there's a conclusion with 2 serial premises.
Yeah, so which of these 3 is it? You're spot on, Ryan. So is it A? A is correct. And what you can see looking at this is the main conclusion of this argument is that the Nets will be better than the Knicks this year. And what's your premise for that? What's that the Nets have more superstar players. And then the fact that the Nets have these 3 guys is intended to be an explanation for the fact that they have more superstar players, which is in turn proof that the Nets are going to be better than the Knicks. So does that make sense to everyone? This is just a straightforward serial argument. So A is the correct answer because that's the diagram for serial. That all sound good?
Yeah.
All right. This one up here, we have you should get pizza for dinner. Pizza is cheap, pizza is yummy. Which of these 4 potential argument structures, A, B, C, or D, is the correct answer? Which of these corresponds to the pizza argument?
Would it be C?
It would be C. Why do you say C, Nat?
Because the conclusion would be you should get pizza for dinner, and then pizza is cheap, which is one premises, and then pizza's yummy is the other premises that equal the.
And what's the key about the 2 premises? Do they have anything to do with each other essentially other than having to do with pizza?
No.
No. You have 2 independent reasons. So the reason B is wrong is, well, pizza is cheap is not the conclusion. The reason A is wrong is because pizza is yummy is not a reason to believe pizza is cheap. And then D, the third one, is wrong because pizza is yummy and pizza is cheap are not linked together. All right, so those 2 are out of the way. Let's look at this one then. Make sure it's actually on the screen. All right, I'm either alive or I'm dead. I'm not dead, so I'm alive. Which of these three is correct? We have A, B, C, and D.
C.
So what is the thinking behind C here? What is let's work through. So first off, let's just ask ourselves, this argument here, before we start worrying about the pictures, what is going on in this case? What is the conclusion, first off? What is the thing that the person's trying to prove if they were to say these three sentences?
Number
Say that again,
one.
Matt?
Why?
Number one is the conclusion.
So what we're saying, if we say one is the conclusion, what we're saying is that 2 and 3 support it. So is it the case that I know that is it true that if I'm not dead and I'm alive, then I'm either dead or alive? Is that necessarily the case? Well, what would a zombie say in that case? What is a zombie?
Undead?
Undead. So in that case, a zombie's not dead. But in this case, you wouldn't be able what's the best way of putting this? Because the so is here, what we know is that this does not follow from these two, because I'm alive, I'm not dead. Well, I mean, I guess, actually, sorry.
So
Matt,
then,
you're 100% right that it could have been a case in which if you know you're not dead and you are alive, then it is true you're either alive or you're dead. But the giveaway here that 3 was the conclusion was that so. So if to be a little clearer here, we've got therefore. So let's put a therefore here. So the way it was laid out, 3 is supposed to be the conclusion. I think you're right that you could theoretically argue that 1 was the conclusion if I just put those sentences. But once I put the therefore, I'm intending 3 to be the conclusion.
no, my
So if that's-
apologies. I missed the,
Oh, no.
I missed the
It was,
so.
I was unclear on it. Because you're right that if I'm alive, then I'm either alive or dead. That's a true statement. So you could have gone the other way. So in this case, if 3 is the conclusion, then which of these 2 statements do we know it can't be?
A and B.
It can't be A and B. Why? Well, because at the top of A and B is 1. That's the arrow there. That's where the arrow's going. And 1 is not the conclusion. 3 is the conclusion, which means it has to either be C or D. So now the question is does the fact that the conclusion is I'm alive, do we know I'm alive because I'm not dead? Or are we, or a better way of putting this is, do we know, are we certain I'm alive simply because I'm not dead? Or, which will then in turn be, I know I'm not dead because I'm either alive or I'm dead. Or is it the case that I'm not dead and I'm either alive or I'm dead together prove that I'm alive?
I think it's D.
Or C.
Yeah, it's D, because in this case, the fact that I'm alive is not just serving the purpose of, the fact that I'm either alive or I'm dead does not prove that I'm not dead. And that's what a serial would be saying. A serial would be saying that I'm alive or I'm dead is giving me reason to believe I'm not dead, which in turn gives me reason to think I'm alive. But what's actually going on in this case is I'm either alive or I'm dead, plus I'm not dead guarantees that I'm alive. So does that make sense? So that's what the linked one means, is that the 2 of them are working together towards this conclusion. So anytime it's a premise in which the parts need to work together to prove the conclusion, when the premises of that argument have to work together to prove the conclusion, it is a case in which it is a linked premise. Was that a little bit clearer once I stipulated that I meant
Yes.
3 to be the conclusion? All right.
Yes.
So now what we're going to do is look at a couple slightly harder ones. So let me, let's go here. So what I want to show now is that you can have arguments that involve both parts that are serial, parts that are convergent, etc. And this is what we talked about the other day in class, but I just want to review and give an answer here, or like show how the parts fit together. So here's our structure for this one. Can everyone see? We've got 1 premise, or one statement, two statement, three statement, four statement. So before we look at the sentences themselves, what does this arrow mean? Just this arrow here. What does that symbolize?
The
conclusion?
conversion. Oh,
So this is the conclusion up here at the top, but what is the one that has these little connected things? Because remember, convergent was these, where they're not touching. What is this
Linked?
touching?
Linked.
Yeah, this is a linked. So just looking at this, you know there's going to be two linked premises that work towards the conclusion. And then what does this mean right here? What is the purpose of this little guy? It's down here going to there, which then links up with the other one. So what would we say this one is? Say that again, Lauren?
Aren't they linked together?
So this isn't
Serial?
quite linked. Serial, there you
No,
go.
that's
Yeah.
serial, yeah.
Yeah, because it's one and then the other. So what we know is of these four statements, one of them is a conclusion. Two of them are linked premises which prove that conclusion. And the last one is some piece of evidence that's proving one of the premises. So looking over this statement, if a person is from Pennsylvania, they aren't trustworthy. I know this because I once met someone from Pennsylvania and they weren't trustworthy. And if someone isn't trustworthy, then you shouldn't lend them money. So if someone is from Pennsylvania, you shouldn't lend them money. What would be the main thing if someone were to say all four of these sentences? What would be the main takeaway that they were trying to get across?
4 is the conclusion.
Yeah, 4 is the conclusion. So if someone's from Pennsylvania, you shouldn't lend them money. That's 4. That is our main conclusion. It goes up here because that's where the conclusion goes, the very tippy top. Then the question is, we now have 1, 2, and 3. What is the relationship between them? We know that 2 of them are going to be linked premises that prove that conclusion. And we know that the last one is going to be a supporting evidence for one of those 2 premises. It's serial with one of, but not the other premise. So looking at this, what are the 2 premises that together are linked and prove number 4 to be the case? Or we could go the other way and ask, which one of these premises' sole purpose is just to prove one of the other premises?
2 and 1, would they be the serial?
So 2 and 1. So, and what would their relationship be? Which one is supporting which? Because you're correct that those are the serial ones.
2 is supporting 1.
Yeah, because why? Well, 2 is your reason or your evidence for believing that people from Pennsylvania are not trustworthy. So what does that leave 3? Well, 3 is, there's only one spot left. 3 has to go here. So what this argument is saying is that if someone is from Pennsylvania, then they aren't trustworthy. And if someone isn't trustworthy, you can't lend them money. Together lead to the conclusion that if someone's from Pennsylvania, you can't lend them money. And how do you know it's true that someone from Pennsylvania isn't trustworthy? Well, you met someone once and they weren't trustworthy. So this is another like a 4 premise or 3 premise, 1 conclusion argument where the parts are working together towards this conclusion. And the reason this is useful is we can now, with this argument in front of us, assess why it is or is not a good argument. So, is this a good argument? Should you, from these premises, come to the conclusion that if someone's from Pennsylvania, you shouldn't lend them money?
Yes,
Just
I think it is.
Say that again.
I think it is. I think it's a good argument.
So yeah, so here's what we can say here is if you accept all the premises are true, then it begins to look like you should conclude this. In particular, if you just concentrate on 1, 3, and 4, you'll recognize that that's a valid argument. Because if it's the case that if a person is from Pennsylvania, they aren't trustworthy is true, and you know for certain that someone isn't trustworthy, then you shouldn't lend them money. Then you know for certain that someone from Pennsylvania, you shouldn't lend them money. However, how many of you, if you were told by someone not to lend someone from Pennsylvania money because one time this person met somebody untrustworthy, would you necessarily believe that they should, this new other person from Pennsylvania, you shouldn't give them? You meet someone in college, they're from Pennsylvania originally, they seem very trustworthy. Should you conclude just because this other person once met someone from Pennsylvania that wasn't trustworthy, that you shouldn't give this new friend some money if they ask?
No.
No, you shouldn't. So what this shows is what? where is the weakness in this argument? If you were to point to someone who gave you this argument and said, hey, I think your reasoning is not actually proving the truth of what you say. I'm not going to believe that anyone from Pennsylvania is not worthy of giving you money. So where would you point to the issue be?
I think it would be 2, right?
Yeah, so the link between 2 and 1 is not a good link. So what we can do here is say, why is it the case that this is a bad argument ultimately? It's not the problem with 1, 3, and 4, because that's perfectly valid. It's rather that going off of a single instance of somebody being untrustworthy to draw a conclusion about everybody from a state is not a good way of reasoning. That right there, so this part of the argument is valid, but this part is not inductively valid because you're coming about a conclusion about the future or a general claim on the basis of a single instant. So what we find is the argument as a whole, even though this part of it is perfectly valid, is not a good argument because it's got this invalid conclusion right here. And that's why it's useful to chart these things out. You can find out exactly where the weakness in this argument is. Does that make sense to everyone? Of why do we spend the time talking about these various sorts of things? Well, we do it so we can get better at recognizing when they're good, when they're bad, and where the good bad bits are.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Just want to make sure that I'm not totally losing everyone here. All right. So that was another rather simple one. There's really only 2 more that I want to go over. And then I want to just preview what we're going to be talking about next time. So this next one is similar to that one, but again, it's got one extra premise in here. So again, we've got our little chart. So this here is going to correspond to what's going on over here. Critical thinking is a useful skill. Critical thinking helps at work. That's because it helps you solve workplace problems before they happen. Critical thinking helps at home as well. That's because it makes you communicate more clearly with family and friends. So this is an argument, 5 statements. Which of these 5 statements is the conclusion? What is the main thing that somebody saying this would be trying to get across?
The first sentence.
Yeah, the first sentence. Critical thinking is a useful skill. That is the thing that if somebody said all 5 of these sentences, that's what they'd be trying to get across. So if that's the conclusion, where does it go in our little chart of the argument?
The top of the chart.
Yeah, very tippy top. There's 1. So now we know 1 is critical thinking is a useful skill. Now, looking at the others, critical thinking helps at work. That's because it helps solve workplace problems before they happen. Critical thinking helps at home as well. That's because it makes you communicate more clearly with friends and family. So those are our sentences. Now, looking at this structure, how would you describe what's going on? Well, first off, if we just look at this right here, if we cover up the bottom half, what is the relationship between this, and the conclusion?
They're the 2 arguments that are both different, but they help explain the conclusion.
Exactly. We have 2 premises that are not connected, but provide independent reason for the conclusion. So our word for this one is
Convergent.
convergent. Exactly. These are 2 convergent premises. Now, let's cover up this half of it. What do we have right there? If you just look at that half of it, how would you describe? You've got a premise, a conclusion. Say it again, Netta.
Serial.
Yeah. So right here you have a serial. And then if we cover this half, what do we have?
Another serial.
Another serial. So just looking at this, what we know the structure of this argument is 2 sets of converging serial premises. So what this means is somewhere over here are going to be 2 sentences where one supports another and it supports the conclusion. And then separate from that, there's going to be a second pairing in which you have a specific statement that's supporting a more general statement that's supporting the conclusion. So what then goes where? What goes here? What goes here? What goes here? And what goes here?
3 supports 2 and 5
3
supports
supports
4.
2 and 5 supports 4. Exactly. And so which one goes where then? First off, does it matter which goes here versus here?
No.
No.
No, it does not. So we know that 3 supports 4. or 3 supports 2, 5 supports 4. So the supporting one goes where? Here or here?
The bottom.
Yeah, the bottom. So 3 supports 2 and 5 supports 4. So this is the structure of this argument. And what this is saying is we have a statement here that is providing evidence for a statement that proves that critical thinking is useful. And then we have a different piece of evidence that supplies evidence for a reason that's different from number 2 as to why critical thinking is useful. So what we have is critical thinking helps. One of the reasons that critical thinking is a useful skill is that it helps at work. And it helps at work because it helps you solve workplace problems before they happen. And another reason that critical thinking is a useful skill is that critical thinking helps at home. And it helps at home because it helps you communicate more clearly with family and friends. Does that make sense about how this little structure is basically just a way of putting in a picture form the line of thinking that you'd have back here when you were to present these sentences?
Yes.
Okay. The main reason why it's useful to do these little charts is what they help you see is that human thought is complicated and exists in these sorts of hierarchies. If you just put a string of sentences in a row, it can look like what's happening is the relationship between 1 and 2 is the same as the relationship between 2 and 3 is the same as between 3 and 4, etc. But really, they exist in a more complex sort of relationship. And what this is when you think what's going on, the thinking that's behind you saying these 5 sentences is much more accurately captured by this little picture. What you're doing when you're doing this is you are first making a general claim, then providing a reason for it, and then providing support for that reason. Same thing over here. You'd be providing a claim, a reason for that, and then further evidence. And so that's why these charts are useful. They put in picture form what's really going on in your head. Well, what you're writing in sentence form doesn't capture that quite as well. And another thing that's useful to think of further down the line is these sorts of structures are going to be more the way that you're going to want to structure a paper or something like that. Now, you're not going to have to, you could imagine actually, you're not going to have to actually write a paper on this topic, but you can imagine somebody in a critical thinking class saying your first paper assignment is going to be a paper on why critical thinking is a useful skill. And you come up with 2 general ideas, namely that it helps you at work and it helps you at home. So you would have individual body paragraphs about each of those major ideas. And then within those body paragraphs, what you'd bring up is your evidence for it. So what you'd have here is basically a 3-paragraph paper, an introductory paragraph, a paragraph about why it helps at work, and a paragraph about why it helps at home. And so that's how understanding the structure of what you want to do is going to be useful when it comes time to present your own ideas in a paper form or in an argument form or anything like that. Good?
Good.
Sir.
And again, there's nothing new that we're covering today. This is just reviewing the stuff that we talked about last time. We'll talk in a second a little bit more about what makes an argument good versus bad, so that next time when we're talking about bad arguments, it's clearer. But really, this is all the stuff I want to do today, is just talk about what these little structures are. Now, we've got our big doozy of one. This one is definitely the most complicated, and I just want to make sure it is fully visible on the board. So, is everyone able to see everything from here over to here?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to try to be off the screen so you can all read it. So here's the argument we have. It's 12 total sentences. What we have is, if someone is in my yard, then they broke in. My neighbor is in my yard, so my neighbor broke in. And if someone broke in, they either dug under my fence, climbed over my fence, knocked part of my fence down, or flew. So that means my neighbor dug, climbed, knocked down, or flew. My neighbor can't fly. He's got no wings. He can't climb. He's too old. He can't dig. He doesn't own a shovel. So my neighbor knocked over part of my fence. That is 12 sentences that exist in this structure right here. The question now is, and this is basically what your homework will be. I don't think there's any that are quite this complicated in the homework, but the job is to figure out what premises go in what spot of this more complicated argument. So I'm going to give you a second to just look this over and try to start figuring out what goes where, or at least just recognizing, reading this over, some of the relationships that exist between some of the sentences, and just looking at this structure to identify, oh, there's a conclusion here. Oh, there's some linked premises here, et cetera, et cetera. So just look that over for 1 second while I grab a drink, and then we can start analyzing what's going on. All right, looking at these sentences, what would you say is the main conclusion? Where if somebody bothered to say all 12 of these sentences, what would they be trying to get across?
Would 3 be the conclusion? So my neighbor broke in.
So what I'm going to say there, Nat, is you are right that that is in some sense a conclusion. That is one of the things that you need to get across. However, if you just have with my neighbor broke in, then the question is, so my neighbor broke in is clearly connected to 1 and 2. But if the main thing we're trying to get across is that my neighbor broke in, what is the point of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12? Does that make sense? So what I'm saying is, Nat, you were 100% spot on that my neighbor broke in is not at the very bottom of our pyramid. It is a conclusion of something. But is it the final conclusion? Is it the main thing we want to work towards at the end of the day? And the reason why I'm suggesting it's not is because what you want your main conclusion to do is be the thing that comes after all the premises, not just some of them. And for so my neighbor broke in, we could get that conclusion even if we didn't talk about some of this stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Sakshi says my neighbor knocked over part of my fence. So which number is that? That's number 12. Is this the correct answer? Lauren says 12 as well.
I want to say,
Yeah.
Yeah, those of you stick with your initial answer. Yes, 12 is the correct conclusion for the whole thing. And why? And because we have Nat is correct that this here is in some sense a conclusion of some of the other premises. It's just not the ultimate conclusion because not everything works us towards this point. However, to come to the conclusion that my neighbor knocked over part of the fence, everything else is involved somehow, which is what this picture is showing. Every other sentence in this collection plays some role in reaching the conclusion that my neighbor knocked over part of my fence. By contrast, so my neighbor broke in. The fact that he's got no wings is not directly coming to the conclusion that my neighbor broke in. If in a different argument, it could be, but in this particular case, it's not. So then, if that's our ultimate conclusion, what can we now say looking at this chart? Just looking at this chart right here, let's ignore the bottom half. If you were just to describe what's going on right here, what would you say is happening? Don't worry about what the sentence is.
that they're all separate points, but they all come to the conclusion of my neighbor knocked over part of my fence.
So they're separate in one sense, but are they completely unrelated?
No, they're related though. So
Yeah,
they're related,
so-
but yeah.
So what we have here is 4 linked premises that together prove 12. So what this is suggesting is that this one, this one, this one, and this one, none of them by themselves prove that my neighbor knocked over my fence. Rather, all 4 of them together prove that my neighbor knocked over my fence. So what we're looking for here to fill in this spot is we're looking for 4 statements that together entail or together prove that it must be the case that my neighbor knocked over my fence. So just looking this over, what 4 things that if you knew, we could get rid of all the other sentences, what are the 4 things that if you know that those 4 things are true, you can be guaranteed that the neighbor knocked over the fence?
I did it in a different way. Like I started with the bottom part, but I think that and worked it to 12, but I think that the 4 is 5, 6, 9, and 10.
6. And he can't. So we have 5, which is my neighbor Doug. 6, which is can't fly. Or my neighbor Doug. 6, which is can't fly. What was the last one the last two you said?
9 and
9, which is
10.
old 10. So 5, Doug, 6, 9, 10 is dig. This is the or statement. So what I will say is that you are correct that some of these are necessarily the ones that are linked in. And you're also correct that every single one of these is somehow related to another one. So you are correct that all of these play some role in this. So all of these are going to be closely related up to 12. However, let's just write this out. So 5 is my neighbor Doug climbed. I'm just going to use this little symbol here. Or Doug climbed, knocked down, or flew. 6 was no fly. 9 is old. And 10 is can't dig. Those were the ones you said, right?
Yes.
5. So in this old statement, well, let's start here. No flying. Why is it that these together you think combine it? Well, what was the thing we said where this marker is either in my left hand or it's in my right hand, and it's not in my right hand, therefore it has to be in my left. Anyone remember what we called that line of reasoning?
Wait, I had a mistake. It's 5, 6, 8, and 10.
I was gonna leave it there so you could, I was hoping you'd catch it, and you did. So yeah, it's not fly, he can't climb, and he can't dig. Why are these the ones together that lead to the conclusion that he had to have knocked over part of my fence? Well, what the first statement is saying is that we only have 4 options for how he got in. And then what each of these statements is doing is knocking off one of those options. So we started with Doug, and we know he can't dig, he doesn't have the shovel. He climbed, we know he can't climb, and he can't fly. So what does that leave us with? Knocked down. So that's spot on. What we have in this little line of 4 is that 5, 6, 8, 10. They go in some of these slots at this level. Now the question is, which one goes in which slots? So then, we've got, just looking at this argument, what we can see is that, well, what's the relationship if we just focus on this?
Serial.
Serial. So we know, and what about this one?
Same.
Same
Serial.
and same again. So what we have here is 3 sets of serial premises that are quite similar and one much larger collection of linked premises. So if we look over here, just looking at these, we had sentence 5, which is a long or statement, 6, which is a short can't fly statement, 8, which is a short can't climb statement, and 10, which is a short can't dig statement. Of those, which one stands out as not like the others?
5.
5 looks a little different. Why? Well, it's a much longer sentence. And why is this relevant? Why is it relevant that 5 is different? Well, we're looking here on the chart for 3 things that look essentially the same and 1 thing that looks quite a bit different from the others. So if you were to take a stab at it, of 5, 6, 8, and 10, what goes where in this little chart? Which is the one that needs to go in the spot which is separate from all the others?
5.
Yeah, 5. So where do we put it? Right here. 5 goes there, which then leaves, well, we now know 6, 8, and 10 are in this spot, and it doesn't matter what order they go in, because all of them are just serving as another one of these linked premises. And each of those just has an underlying serial premise. So now that we've figured this out, the question is, what do we do with 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 9, and 11? So looking at this, what is the point of 7? What is the point of he's got no wings?
It's to support 6 that he can't fly.
Yeah, so what 7, the only point of 7 is to explain why 6 is true. So looking at this chart, a premise that's only point is to support 6, that he can't fly, where would that go?
So we'll go under 6.
Yeah, exactly. So 7 goes there, where the only point of 7 is to support 6. And then what about what goes here?
9.
9 goes there. And why? What's the 9 is he's too old. Again, why does 9 go there?
To support 8. That
Exactly,
he
and that's
can't fly.
yeah, and then 11 just goes here for exactly the same reason. So what's left? Well, all that's left now is we have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So all that's left is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, just looking over these sentences, let's notice some things about them. This first sentence here, what is the key words that are in this first sentence? And by keywords, I mean, you've seen them on the board a lot. Before yard, before any of the substantive ones, what are like the key words that we've seen? Say that again, but I just cut you off like 7 times.
If.
Yeah, if and then. So we have an if-then statement. And not only that, now let's take a closer look at this. We've got, as Sakshi says, yard is in this one here. Where else is yard?
2.
2. So not only do we have an if-then statement, we have an if-then statement in which the thing that's in the first bit, that someone's in my yard, is related to this second bit, namely that my neighbor's in my yard. So what do we think then is the relationship between 1, 2, and 3? As Nat said, one of these is a conclusion. Which one's the conclusion? If we just forget about the rest of the argument and just look at 1, 2, and 3.
3.
1 is the conclusion.
So we have 3 and 1 being said. 3 is the 3 is the conclusion, because this is just an if A then B, A therefore B statement. So if A then B, A B. Or if I wanted to be strictly speaking, I left out a step of like saying that your neighbor is a human, but I think we all know that your neighbor is a human by definition. But if we want to be really strictly speaking, if neighbor's in my yard, then they broke in. My neighbor is in my yard, therefore my neighbor broke in. So we've got an if A then B, and A therefore B. Which means if we were drawing a chart just for these 3 sentences, what would that chart look like? What type of arrow would I use? This type, or this type?
The linked one, is it? Am I correct?
Yep, exactly, Nat. The third one. So we know that we are dealing with a linked here. And then which one's the conclusion? And where does the conclusion go?
On the top, 3 would
The
go on
conclusion
top.
goes on the top. So my neighbor broke in, and 1 and 2. Now looking right here, this looks a lot like what? We now know that this has to be part of the argument. And not only that, it has to slot in somewhere over here. Because over here, we know that there's a linked premise in the argument where the conclusion is 3. Looking at this chart, given what's left, where could this go?
The bottom.
Yeah, the very bottom. Because while this arrow looks the same, we already know that what's up here has to be 5. So it has to go here, where 3 is here, 1 is here, and 2 is here. Which then, process of elimination, leaves what? Where does 4 go? Well, 4 has to go here. So what we can see now is you can understand this line of reasoning, which intuitively makes sense. If we know that anyone who's in your yard had to have broken in, and the neighbor broke in, then we know that and the neighbor's in the yard, then we know the neighbor broke in. Not only that, if you combine the fact that your neighbor broke in with the fact that if the neighbor broke in, they either dug or climbed or knocked or flew, allows you to conclude 5, namely that the neighbor climbed or knocked or dug or flew. Then if you combine this with the fact that, they can't fly because they don't have wings, the fact they can't climb because they're too old, and the fact they can't dig because they don't have a shovel. Well, now you've proven in this long line of reasoning that you know for certain that your neighbor knocked down part of your fence. So does that whole long chain of reasoning, all building up here, does that make sense about how we get to this main conclusion and we're able to be certain that this conclusion is true, just working our way up from the bottom?
Yeah.
Okay, and as Netta said, there are many ways of going about this. This is what it's really like puzzle solving. It's a matter of just taking the time to figure out, well, I can understand intuitively what someone saying these things would be trying to do or trying to say. And then trying to figure out, well, if I know that somebody would be trying to prove that if somebody said this in court, they'd be trying to prove that their neighbor knocked over part of the fence and deserved to be compensated for it. Well, what is their reasoning that gets there? Of all the other things they say, how does it all fit together to reach that conclusion? And again, the point of this would be to show that once you lay out the argument in this way, you might be able to then show if somebody were trying to reach this conclusion, maybe part of the argument's wrong. Maybe you shouldn't believe their conclusion because something over here is flawed. So for instance, somebody who was arguing against this, say the neighbor said something like, oh, you're wrong that the only ways are I broke in, I dug under, etc. Maybe you could have invited me over. So they'd be saying 4 is wrong. And you can see that if 4 is wrong, the whole argument falls apart because 4 is down here supporting so much else. Does that make sense about why? So why the hell are we taking the time to do this? Well, it's because once you lay this out, you can start to see what it would take to make this argument false. And you can start to see what you'd have to show to prove that this argument's true.
I have a question.
Yeah, Netta.
Is the right way to go like from the top, or is it okay to like?
There's not, and I wanted to highlight this, there's not a right way here. It's whatever works for you. And so the way I just did it is the way that I happen to do it. If I was doing this in 10 minutes, I may have done it differently. But another way you can do is look for like, what are the statements that seem like all they're doing is supporting other statements and not working toward the major conclusion? And you see, well, what's the point if he's got no wings? Well, the only point of he's got no wings is to show that my neighbor can't fly. It's doing no other work. So therefore, it's got to be one of these bottom serial premises. So yeah, that's another equally good way of doing it. This is basically just like forcing you to do some puzzle solving, just to work on how do parts fit together? How do we understand the structure of this more complex argument? All right, are there any questions about this or the general the general project of I give you an argument, you come up with the structure? Any questions at all?
Not yet.
Right.
I'll probably have some questions over the weekend.
Yes, and what I was going to say is the homework is going to be a lot of these little things where I give you blanks and ask. I am going to be around this weekend. I'm going to be near my computer. If you have any questions on any of the homework assignment, feel free to reach out. Some of them are simpler. The final one's a little more complicated. But if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask. Another thing I'll say is on the homework, I ask you to explain your answers. And the main purpose of my including that is so that I can do everything I can to give partial credit. So generally speaking, if you were to get this argument and you were to just like switch around certain spots, or you accidentally had something like, say, this, and you explain in your reasoning something as to why you did this, I'm going to be able to give you some partial credit based on that. So if you're certain you know the right answer, I'm not going to take off points if your chart is perfect. But if you want to ensure that you get some good, best chance possible for partial credit, make sure to include like a short little statement of the point of number 7 is only to support number 6. That's why it goes here. Or something along the line of, this is one of the major premises that is connected to 12. Anything along those lines so that I can give partial credit. I'm not trying to screw anyone over with this homework assignment. I will be quite lenient with the grading. It's really just to practice doing these little sorts of charts. Any other questions on it? All right, if not, I just want to preview basically what we're going to be talking about next time. Oh, Lauren, did you have a question?
No, I was gonna say, I think I'm okay.
Okay. And again, if anyone has any questions, and also because I'm around, if somebody's having trouble and wants to have a Zoom meeting at any point this weekend, just shoot me an email. We can set up a Zoom. If you need a little extra time, you know, your weekend's crazy, you need a little extra time, can't turn it until Tuesday morning, just reach out, let me know. I don't want this to cause any stress. This stuff, I will be the first to admit, this is not the most stimulating, exciting type of stuff. If you are a complete sucker for logic and just find the way these things fit together and enjoy puzzles, which I do, you might find some enjoyment out of it. But even I, who find this stuff kind of fun, admit it's way less interesting than some of the later stuff this semester. So I don't want to make it any more miserable than it, like, you know, we have to learn this stuff because it's the bare bones beginning stuff. And we can't really talk about bad reasoning until we know what good reasoning is. So I just want to make sure, though, that everyone's on board with the general statements. If so, then again, email me. We can set up Zoom. Any questions you have this weekend, we're good to go. But basically what I want to talk about to finish off is, now that we've seen what good arguments are and what validity is, what we'll be talking about next class and the class after is some bad lines of reasoning. Things in which you have a premise that leads towards a conclusion, and it can seem like a really, really intuitively satisfying piece of information or a satisfying reason to support the conclusion. But when you pause and think about it a little more closely, what you find is the relationship between this premise and the conclusion it's supporting is not a valid one. So another way of putting that is, even if this premise is true, that's not a guarantee that the conclusion is going to be true. So for instance, one of the ones we'll be talking about is, let's go with a simple explanation for why is it that so many children believe in Santa Claus? What is the reason? Conclusion: Santa is real. What is most children's reason for believing that Santa is real?
Because they've been told that. I don't know.
Yeah, so their premise is, my mom told me so, or my dad, or whoever. Why then? What does this show then? Why is it that the fact that your mom told you so doesn't prove that Santa's real? Simply put, what were your parents doing to you your whole childhood if you were somebody who believed in Santa?
They were
Why?
Yeah, your parents were lying to you all of your early childhood, and it was for a good reason. Gifts are another reason. Where did these gifts come from? I didn't see mom and dad buy them, or I didn't see anyone. So what we find here is, intuitively speaking, an authority figure, someone in a position of power and love of you, telling you something is true, oftentimes makes us think that the conclusion must be true. But what the Santa example shows us is that turning to this sort of coming to a conclusion simply on the basis that someone told you so, with no evidence of why they might or might not be lying, is not a good way to draw a conclusion. This type of reasoning, which seems very promising and seems like a good way of reaching a conclusion, but is ultimately bad, is what is called a fallacy. And we are going to, for the next two classes, be talking about some common fallacies, so that we will be on the lookout to make sure, because much of the time, because they are intuitively very satisfying, they satisfy our common sense, we often fall for fallacies, even though we shouldn't, because a fallacy is a way of reasoning that is not valid. It just looks like a valid one. And you will come across articles, you will come across politicians, you will come across advertisements that are trying to get you to do something using fallacies. And so if you know what they are and how they're different from the valid arguments we've been talking about, you will be better prepared to recognize them in the wild. And then, just to say a little bit more about how the semester is going to go, once we've got these fallacies in front of us, and once we've done the midterm about the fallacies and all this stuff, we will then talk about the psychology of the human mind that makes these sorts of fallacies and things more likely. So why is it that we're so tending to listen to authority figures? Why is this the case? And so that's what we'll be talking about in a few weeks. But before we get there, we have to do the take-home midterm, and we have to talk about what fallacies are. Any last business questions, comments, concerns? I've said everything I want to say tonight. Does anyone have any thoughts, feelings, comments, questions, anything? All right. In that case, I'm gonna stop the recording. If anyone wants to stick around and ask any quick questions, feel free, but otherwise you're all free to go and I will see you on Tuesday.